The first thing that we'll do is look at quantitative methodology and how this dictates the research process. We'll then talk about how to choose a topic and how to map out the current knowledge by looking at papers in the scientific literature. We'll then talk about how to develop and formulate a clear research question and how to develop an associated hypothesis. And then we'll conclude with giving you some pointers how you can think about the potential impact of your research. So hopefully now you understand some of the key differences between qualitative and quantitative research. The main principle underlying quantitative methodology is that there is a single reality, and it's our job as scientists to establish rules which govern this reality. Ultimately, these rules determine relationships and allow us to make predictions about the external world. When we use quantitative methodology, we start with a theory. This theory is then used to generate a specific hypothesis using what's called as deductive reasoning. Now, deductive reasoning involves going from the very large to the very small. So, for example, if we think about Copernicus, who had the idea that the planets all circulated the sun, we can consider that idea to be his theory. And from that very general theory, he'd have been able to formulate specific hypotheses. So, for example, he might have been able to predict how far the moon would have moved between, say, the hours of 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. He'd then be able to collect experimental data to verify or disprove his particular hypothesis. Now, if the hypothesis was proved correct, that would give weight to his theory, and then he could use the theory again to generate other associated hypotheses. So through this process, we use hypothesis testing to refine our theory. If we think about a similar example in the field of health sciences research, we could think about whether a particular pharmacological agent is effective at inducing muscle relaxation. Again, we take this general theory and we'd formulate a specific hypothesis which would allow us to test whether a particular dose of this drug was able to induce different characteristics in a muscle. Again, by testing that theory, we could either refute or confirm our bigger theory. Another key attribute of quantitative methodology is that your facts or your experimental observations must be obtained objectively. So what we mean by that is that if different people made the same observation, there should be no bias, they should get exactly the same answer. So those measurements should be independent of the observer. Another key thing that differentiates quantitative with qualitative methodology is that all the observations need to be reduced to a number. Now remember, in qualitative methodology, the situation is different, and often the responses from the participants are expressed as phrases or words which have meaning. The situation is different in quantitative science, as we're trying to use statistical methods or mathematical techniques to confirm or to refute our hypotheses, and therefore every observation that we make has to have an associated numerical value. Another thing that we attempt to do in quantitative methodology is to control our experiments. So we often manipulate one variable while measuring another. So for example, we might want to understand the effect of walking speed on muscle activation. Now, if we're to do that, we might ask a range of different people all to walk at different speeds whilst we measured EMG or muscle activation characteristics. Now, a potential confounder there could be footwear. Footwear could influence the way the muscle is active, and so we'd have to ensure that at every speed people wore exactly the same type of footwear. So as we said before, in quantitative methodology, hypothesis testing is used to refine theory. And ultimately what we're trying to do is to put together the pieces of a big jigsaw so that we get a set of theories which are all consistent with each other and allow us to make predictions about the external world. The one last thing to note is that when we apply quantitative methodology, it proceeds sequentially. And this is different from the qualitative approach, where often we move backwards and forwards between the different steps in the research process. So I've outlined here the main steps in the quantitative research process. The first is to identify a philosophical foundation and frame your research problem. So by philosophical foundation, I mean to choose whether you're going to use the quantitative or the qualitative approach. And then in terms of framing your research problem, it's about trying to understand exactly which topic you're going to focus on, and we'll cover that in more detail in this lecture. Once you've done that, you need to go to the literature and understand what theory is currently available and what's the evidence to support that theory. Once you've done that, you can then identify gaps in the current knowledge. And identifying these gaps is something that we'll talk about in detail in subsequent slides. With a clear gap, it should be straightforward then to develop a research question. And once this research question is in place, it's possible to select an appropriate design strategy and set some study boundaries. You then need to consider ethical issues and go out and collect the experimental data required for you to test your particular research question or hypothesis. Once all this data is in place, then you can analyse the information and draw conclusions. And then once you do that, you need to go back to the original theory and try and understand whether that theory is correct. Once you've been through that process, the most important step is then to disseminate your work and to share your knowledge with the wider scientific community. So what should you think about when you're choosing your topic? Firstly, what are you interested in? Is there a particular area of your field which really fascinates you? If you're a healthcare professional, do you frequently come across specific problems in your day-to-day professional practice? Is there a group of patients for which you can't find an appropriate treatment to help them? Is there disagreement amongst your field? Perhaps you've been to a scientific conference recently and heard contrasting views from experts, and you'd like to do some research to try and understand which viewpoint you think is actually correct. Whichever topic you choose, you've got to ask yourself, what do we need to know more about in my professional field? What could ultimately help patients and improve healthcare outcomes in the longer term? Once you've focused on your topic, you need to ask the question about whether it's amenable to a quantitative analysis. Remember, there are two approaches, the quantitative and the qualitative approach to research. And in order to be able to apply the quantitative approach, we need to be able to make objective measurements of the phenomena that we're interested in. And we need to be able to reduce those measurements to a number. So if we're measuring factors such as muscle activations or drug concentrations, then it's fairly straightforward to use a quantitative approach, as these things can be easily quantified. However, if we're interested in patients' perception of a particular clinical service, then we might wish to carry out a piece of qualitative research first before we move on to a quantitative analysis. So, if we ask ourselves the question, can our topic be researched using quantitative methods? And if the answer is no, we should think about a qualitative approach. If it's yes, we then need to move on and define scope and boundaries for the study. Once you've decided on your topic, then you need to define clear scope and boundaries for your study. Now, these boundaries are going to inform the way that you do your literature search. Think about the scope as the general topic that you'll focus on, and this scope will ultimately help you to write out the search terms that you'll use in the search engines. Think about the boundary as what you consider to be outside the remit of your project, and these boundaries will help you to get rid of papers that you don't feel lie within the scope of your project. Let's say, for example, you were interested in the effect of footwear interventions
on patients with knee osteoarthritis. You might define the general topic as anything to do with footwear or knee osteoarthritis. However, you might consider the boundaries of the study and say that you would only really be interested in trials which have tested new interventions on patients who actually have knee osteoarthritis, and not just general trials of footwear on healthy control subjects. Once you've performed your literature search, you'll have identified a number of key publications which you think are very relevant to your topic. The best thing I think then is to try and develop a mental map or a topic map of all the current knowledge. Think about the scope of the study as a big bubble in the middle of this map. And outside that, you'd have different bubbles corresponding to the different ideas in the research field. What you want to try and do is make as many links as you can so that you can see how the different ideas which have been presented before are all related to each other. Ideally, what you'd want to do is, once you've got all your bubbles or your ideas in your map, is just write on maybe a number which identifies each of the separate publications. You'll often see that different publications span a number of different ideas within your field, and so it's a really good idea to draw out one of these maps and associate papers with the different ideas. Once you've done that, I'd suggest using a reference manager, something like EndNote, to organise your references along the different ideas within your topic.
So you're now in a situation where you have defined the scope and boundaries of your problem, you've identified the key papers, and you have some sort of map, a mental map which tells you about all the ideas across your field. Now, before we start to review that literature and understand how to develop gaps in the field, I just want to review the ideas around level 1, 2 and 3 studies which you had read about in the previous document. Level 1 studies, as we spoke about earlier, are designed simply to describe a particular phenomena and are often carried out when there's not much theoretical or conceptual material available. So, if we simply wanted to understand the prevalence of falls in a particular elderly population, we might carry out a survey. And typically level 1 questions lead to surveys, descriptive designs, exploratory studies, needs assessments and case studies. So just as an example, we might ask, what's the prevalence of polio amongst children aged 10 to 16 in India? Or we might ask, what are the characteristics of ataxic gait? And you can see there that we're not actually trying to understand any cause or effect or potential correlations between variables, just simply to describe a particular phenomena. The next level, level 2 questions, are designed to explore relationships among phenomena. And these sort of questions are typically posed once a level 1 investigation has been carried out. Level 2 questions typically lead to passive observational studies and, as we spoke about in the previous document, epidemiological designs. So, sort of examples that we might see in health sciences. What's the relationship between dorsiflexor muscle strength and stride length in children with cerebral palsy? Is there an association between the strength of the hip adductors and knee osteoarthritis? And what's the link between obesity and type 2 diabetes? And you can see in each of those questions we're trying to understand a relationship, an association or a link between two experimentally measured variables. Now, you need to bear in mind that level 2 questions, or research designs which correspond to level 2 questions, cannot address cause and effect. They simply show that two variables are related to each other. And we need to ask a level 3 question in order to test possible cause and effect. So level 3 questions contain predictive statements about what will happen to one variable on the basis of knowing something about another. And they always involve some sort of manipulation by the experimenter. So the experimenter will manipulate one of the variables whilst measuring the effect on another variable. So for example, in the previous level 2 slide, we looked at whether there could be a relationship between hip adductor strength and pain in knee osteoarthritis. Now, we may see that relationship, but that relationship we don't know anything about cause and effect. So, do people develop weak muscles because of their pain, or is their pain somehow related to the or cause of their weakness in their muscles? So, in order to test that idea, we could ask the question, would strengthening of the hip adductors improve clinical outcomes in patients with knee osteoarthritis? Now, if we were able to show that by improving strength we reduced pain, then we could maybe argue something about the causality of pain due to muscle strength. Similarly, we could ask the question about what are the effects of a high eccentric muscle force training program on a high full risk elderly population. Again, in this scenario, as an experimentalist, we would be manipulating something. We would be giving individuals this high eccentric muscle force training program and understanding the effect it had on variables which quantified full risk in a particular population, in this case an elderly population. Now, every level 3 question would require a true experimental design, such as a randomized controlled trial. And all of these true experimental designs will be discussed in more detail in the session on research design, which you'll receive in a few weeks' time. So going back to our literature search, what it's worth doing at this point is going through all the papers and trying to identify whether it's a level 1, a level 2 or a level 3 paper. So typically, if not much is known in a particular field, you might see that all that's been done is a level 1 descriptive study. Or alternatively, if there's quite a lot of work, there could have been quite a few level 2 studies that have looked at correlations, how variables interact, and there could be quite good knowledge of which variables are related to others. If that's the case, then it might be worth thinking about developing your own question at level 3 to try and predict whether a particular treatment would work, or whether you could choose a particular subset of people on which to target an intervention which is known to work reasonably well. So hopefully by this point you've got yourself into a situation where you've got a clear idea of all the previous papers, you understand the level of knowledge, you've got a map linking all the different ideas together. And once you've got that big framework in your mind, you can start to ask yourself some important questions. Firstly, what are the key issues in this particular field? Secondly, although there will have been previous research, there's always limitations with research, and you need to have identified, or you need to start thinking about identifying the limitations of previous studies and how those limitations could lead to gaps in knowledge and potentially question the validity of the conclusions of those previous papers. As we spoke about in the previous slides, you also need to think about the level of knowledge. Is there just descriptive or correlational studies, or already a lot of level 3 cause and effect type studies? Once you've thought about those issues, you really need to be able to identify the main gaps in understanding. There will no doubt be unanswered questions starting to form in your mind, and you have to try and go through lots of different potential questions. Think about what questions could be asked. Think about the impact of a particular question. If you could answer this question, what impact would it have on clinical practice or on the advancement of this particular scientific field? Once you've identified a definite gap in knowledge and you've decided how you're going to address that gap, you need to formulate a very clear research question. And I would spend a lot of time, if you're developing a research study or writing a research paper, thinking about exactly how you phrase your question.
ask yourself the following questions. Is your research question concise and direct? Is it easily understandable, even to members of people outside your particular professional? Is it focused on the key issues? And is it specific? We don't really want questions that are too broad and not focused on the key issues. The other thing to think about is whether you've selected a topic which is feasible to study, and when you ask your question, is it just one question, or really embedded in that are the multiple questions which need to be addressed separately? So I now want to talk a little bit about hypothesis development. And before we do that, I just need to introduce the concept of an independent and a dependent variable. So by independent variable, I'm talking about a parameter which is manipulated by the researcher, and the dependent variable to the parameter of interest that's potentially influenced by the independent variable. So if we go back to our example before in knee osteoarthritis and muscle strength, we could think about the independent variable as being the strength of the hip adductor muscles, and the dependent variable being, for example, the pain score, the WOMAC pain score. WOMAC is a commonly used scale used to quantify pain in patients with knee osteoarthritis. Another example might be to look at a low back treatment which is aimed at improving abdominal muscle functioning. So the independent variable would be abdominal muscle function, and that's the thing which has been targeted through the intervention. The dependent variable, on the other hand, would be the patient's self-reported pain.
I now want to spend a little bit of time talking about hypotheses which are derived from research questions. And it's important that we can make the distinction between a general research question and a very specific hypothesis. So the formal definition of a hypothesis is that it's a proposition to be tested, or a tentative statement of relationship between two or more variables. And before any hypothesis can be stated, it's important to define what is actually going to be measured for each phenomena that you're studying. So I spoke in the previous document about how we operationalize the phenomena that we're studying. So from a quantitative methodological standpoint, what we mean by operationalize is how do we ascribe numbers to the thing that we're studying. So if it's pain, do we use a scoring system, like a questionnaire-based scoring system to quantify pain? If it's the level of muscle activity, do we use an EMG system, and how do we process that EMG system ultimately to get our number? And it's that number that we're going to perform our statistical analysis on. So those measurements, the way in which we take those measurements, are very important, and they're referred to in the hypothesis. Now, because we're looking at relationships with a hypothesis, we can only develop hypotheses for level 2 and level 3 questions. So level 2, remember, is to do with correlations, and level 3 is to do with cause and effect. And the best to think about a hypothesis is as a researcher's best hunch about actually what they're going to find. So once you've formulated your research question, you would rephrase it into a measurable statement. And then with that hypothesis, what you'll sometimes do is anticipate the direction of the relationship, and the hypothesis will also set the stage for statistical analysis. So let me give you a few examples. So we spoke before about some example research questions at level 1, level 2 and level 3. And as I said, hypotheses can only be formulated at level 2 and 3 because they deal with relationships between variables. So here's an example of a level 2 hypothesis. Does maximal isometric force of the hip adductors correlate with scores on a WOMAC scale in patients with knee osteoarthritis? So you can see we've actually stated what's going to be measured: maximal isometric force of the hip adductors and WOMAC scale pain scores on a WOMAC pain scale. So you can imagine a research question might simply be asking something to do with muscle strength and pain, but actually when we've got the hypothesis here, we're actually including the variables which are going to be measured experimentally. And the fact that we've got the word correlate there sort of suggests that we'll use a correlational statistical analysis. Another example would be that isometric dorsiflexor muscle strength will correlate with stride length in children with cerebral palsy. So again, we're saying what we're going to measure, which is dorsiflector muscle strength, and we're also saying that we're going to measure stride length and specifying population. And we've actually anticipated the direction of the correlation. We're saying it's going to correlate positively. So that's something that's sometimes included in a hypothesis. So if we look at some level 3 hypotheses, after undergoing a hip adductor strengthening program, OA patients will report a decrease in WOMAC scores. So again, we've said what we're going to measure, the WOMAC scores, and we've anticipated the direction of that change. We're saying it's going to decrease. Another example will be surgical lengthening of the hamstring muscles will increase knee extension during the stance phase of gait. So in that situation, again, we've been very specific about what we're going to measure, which is knee extension during the stance phase of gait. And again, we've anticipated the relationship. So we're saying that knee extension will increase. So hopefully by this stage, you've got a good idea about how to go about scoping the literature, mapping out the ideas, thinking about the state of knowledge in the current literature, and then identifying gaps. And then you'll be able to formulate a research question and hopefully an associated hypothesis. And the last thing that you really need to ask yourself is, if you were able to answer your research question, would you A, be able to provide useful information to guide clinical practice, B, validate or falsify existing theory and so progress scientific understanding in a particular area, C, help provide guidance for policymakers, or finally, potentially motivate future scientific study which can have an impact on health outcomes in the short and maybe the long term. So I've just drawn out a little diagram here which illustrates how the introduction to a research paper is typically structured. If you read a paper, you should be able to recognise this structure. So the first thing you'll see in the first 1 or 2 paragraphs is there'll be a few statements establishing the importance of a subject. Once that's been clarified, then there'll be a short review of what's known in the area, what studies have been carried out, what's the state of the theory, what do we understand. Then the introduction should move on to a statement of what's problematic with the known. So where are the gaps in the understanding? Are there any methodological flaws in a particular paper? What needs to be answered? Where are we scientifically, and how can we move the scientific field forward? And once you've made that statement of the unknown, you conclude with a clear statement of the research question or hypothesis. And as you go through the exercises that we've given you to read the papers in this particular session, I'd really recommend that you sort of pay attention to the introduction sections and try to understand and just establish whether the authors have followed that structure. And I think you'll find that most of them have.